The Galactic Council Chamber was a place of cold logic and meticulous order. It was a vast, circular hall, its metallic walls pulsing faintly with the bioluminescent energy of the Zorth architects. The representatives of countless species gathered in tiered rows, their voices blending into a dull hum of overlapping conversations. Floating holographic displays projected the latest war reports, streaked with lines of red that marked their mounting casualties. Counselor Vrkesh, a towering Zelthian with sapphire-hued scales, tapped his lone fingers against the polished table before him. His eyes, multifaceted and glimmering, swept across the assembled diplomats. "The war against the Drelkith insurgents has dragged on longer than expected," he said, his voice a smooth purr that barely masked his irritation. "Our superior fleets have been blunted, our automated targeting systems compromised. We are fighting an enemy who thrives in chaos, and despite our technological mastery, we have yet to force their surrender." Across the table, a reptilian Giovanni general hissed in displeasure. "Our forces were designed for precision, for calculated strikes in controlled environments. The Drelkith scurry through the ruins like vermin, hidden beneath electromagnetic interference. Our drones struggle to lock onto their heat signatures, and our infantry units, well trained as they are not adapted to such primitive battlefields." A chittering ripple of agreement passed through the chamber. The Galactic Council, a union of the most advanced civilizations in known space, prided itself on its efficiency, its mastery of data-driven warfare. Their battles were meant to be fought with the cold detachment of algorithms, where every movement was predicted and every shot landed with machine precision. Yet here they were, locked in a grinding war against an enemy who refused to fight on their terms. Then, from a lower tier, a voice spoke, a voice that, until now, had been disregarded more often than not. "We could deploy human forces to the contested sector." Silence followed. All eyes turned to the speaker, Counselor Elias Monroe, the lone representative of Earth. He sat with practiced ease, his hands clasped together, his gaze unwavering despite the dozens of skeptical stares leveled at him. He had long grown accustomed to humanity's status in the Council, tolerated but not respected, present but rarely considered essential. Vrkesh's mandibles twitched in amusement. "Humans," he echoed, letting the word stretch with deliberate incredulity. "Forgive me, Counselor Monroe, but I fail to see how your species would fare any better than our most elite warriors. Humans are, how shall I put this, clumsy creatures. Your reliance on instinct rather than calculated precision makes you unpredictable. Your physicality is unremarkable, and your technology, while functional, lacks the refinement of our own." A ripple of agreement passed through the chamber. Even those species that had interacted with humanity before had little reason to contradict Vrkesh's words. Humans were durable, yes, and adaptable, but they were also impulsive, prone to error, too reliant on their organic senses in an era of artificial perfection. Monroe, however, remained unfazed. He leaned forward slightly. "You're right about one thing," he said smoothly. "Humans are machines. We don't process the battlefield the way your AI-driven tactics do. We don't have neural-linked targeting systems or precision-calibrated drone support." He let the words hang for a moment before adding, "What we do have is experience with uncertainty. We're not just accustomed to chaos. We thrive in it." Vrkesh exhaled a low, rattling sound. "Grand words, but war is not won by rhetoric. If you insist on offering a demonstration, I assume you have a specific proposal." Monroe smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I propose we deploy a human sniper unit to the battlefront. Just one. Let them operate freely, without AI assistance, without council interference. If, as you say, humans are clumsy and ineffective, then this will be a mere footnote in the war reports. But if I'm right," his eyes flickered with something unreadable, "then your war might have just found its turning point." A murmur spread through the chamber, this time laced with intrigue rather than outright dismissal. The Council thrived on control, on statistics, on strategies calculated to perfection. Yet here was an opportunity to test an anomaly, to measure human unpredictability in a battlefield where their own forces had struggled. VR Kesha's gaze lingered on Monroe for a long moment before he gave a slow nod. "Very well," he conceded. "We shall see if your kind can do more than stumble in the dark." The sniper stood at the edge of the warship's deployment bay, helmet in one hand, rifle in the other. The planet below was a roiling landscape of broken cities and jagged mountain ridges, its once thriving infrastructure reduced to a skeletal graveyard by years of unrelenting conflict. Smoke curled from distant battle sites, the occasional flare of weapons fire piercing the gloom. Gunnery Sergeant Aaron Hale took a slow breath, feeling the familiar weight of his gear settle around him. The Council forces had barely acknowledged his presence on the ship, their biomechanical armor gleaming under artificial lighting, their weapons humming with plasma energy. He could feel their unspoken skepticism, the unvoiced question in their sidelong glances. What is a human doing here? Hale didn't bother answering. He had nothing to prove to them. A metallic voice crackled in his earpiece, the ship's AI signaling final approach. "Drop zone ETA, 60 seconds. Hostile activity detected within 1 kilometer radius." He flexed his fingers around the rifle's grip, checking the scope out of instinct rather than necessity. His weapon was primitive by Council standards. No automated tracking, no targeting algorithms, just a high-powered kinetic projectile system perfected over centuries of human warfare. Behind him, a Zelthian officer, VR Kesha's own military adjutant, watched him with a mixture of skepticism and mild curiosity. "Your kind is strange," the alien mused. "You rely on outdated tools, yet you speak of warfare as if you were its masters. What do you expect to accomplish down there?" Hale finally turned, meeting the alien's gaze with calm certainty. "I expect," he said, "to end this fight the way humans always have." Then the deployment signal flashed, and he stepped into the void. The descent was silent. No thrusters, no controlled landing sequence. Just a streamlined drop pod slicing through the atmosphere, its outer plating absorbing the friction heat as it plummeted toward the war-torn surface. Inside, Aaron Hale remained still, the vibration of the rapid descent barely registering. He had done this before. The darkness, the pressure, the waiting, none of it unsettled him. His pulse was steady, his breathing measured. He had been trained for conditions like these. The Council forces, with their reliance on AI-assisted deployment and calculated risk assessments, would never have tolerated such a free-fall insertion. But Hale wasn't a machine. He was human. The pod impacted the ground with a controlled violence, dust and debris kicking up in thick clouds as the reinforced hatch hissed open. Hale was already in motion, rifle raised, eyes scanning, body low. He moved like a shadow through the ruins, silent and unseen. The wreckage of an old city surrounded him. Half-melted steel, collapsed buildings, shattered roads. What had once been a thriving colony was now a war zone, contested and bled over by factions that cared little for what it had once been. Above, the sky was a battlefield of its own. The Council's sleek, angular warships loomed in orbit, their weapons painting the surface with controlled bursts of plasma fire. But the Drelkith had adapted. They had learned to fight beneath the bombardments, to move unseen beneath layers of interference, to strike from angles that technology alone could not predict. That was why Hale was here. His earpiece crackled. "Sniper team, status?" Hale exhaled slowly, pressing his back against a collapsed support beam. "Ground side. No contact yet. Moving to Overwatch." "Understood. Council forces are deploying 2 clicks west. Expect resistance before rendezvous." Resistance was inevitable. Hale adjusted the rifle scope, feeling the wind shift through the shattered structures. He wouldn't be waiting for the enemy to find him. He would find them first. He moved carefully, navigating through the ruins with practiced efficiency. Every step was measured, every motion calculated to minimize sound. He was acutely aware of how different his approach was from the Council forces, whose movements were dictated by battle algorithms and synchronized unit coordination. They were precise, but precision alone could not adapt to a battlefield that refused to conform. Hale had no illusions about his role. He wasn't here to fight in the Council's place. He was here to show them what they couldn't see. The first sign of enemy presence came in the form of distant movement, a flicker of shifting shadows across the wreckage. Most wouldn't have noticed it, but Hale's eyes were trained for detail, for the unnatural rhythm of a waiting ambush. The Droketh were here. He sank into position, body pressed against the remains of a half-buried transport. His rifle came up, scope aligning with the movement. Through the magnified lens, he caught sight of them. Droketh warriors, their chitinous armor blending seamlessly with the wreckage. They moved with a predatory grace, their elongated limbs carrying them over jagged terrain with ease. There were 5 in the immediate vicinity, but that meant nothing. If 5 were visible, more were waiting just beyond sight. Hale adjusted his breathing. Wind speed, distance, bullet drop. 1,000 calculations ran through his mind, instinct honed through years of experience. He centered his sights on the leading Droketh, the one giving silent hand signals to the others. A commander, or at least something close to it. His finger tightened on the trigger. The shot was deafening in the quiet. A sharp crack of displaced air as the kinetic round left the barrel, slicing through the atmosphere at hypersonic speeds. The Droketh commander's head snapped back, a spray of dark ichor marking the moment of impact. The silence that followed was absolute, then chaos. The remaining Droketh scattered, their ambush unraveling in an instant. They had expected to attack, not to be hunted. Hale didn't give them time to adjust. He shifted targets, squeezing off a second shot before the first body had even collapsed. Another warrior crumpled, their carapace ruptured by the force of the bullet. The survivors scrambled for cover, moving fast but not fast enough. Hale was already repositioning, sliding down from his perch with practiced efficiency. A sniper who remained in one place for too long was a dead sniper. He shifted 30 meters east, scaling a fractured wall, finding a new vantage point just as the Droketh regrouped. One of them barked something in their guttural tongue, likely trying to re-establish command. Hale let them. He wanted them to think they had time. The next shot took the speaker mid-sentence. The remaining Droketh stopped running. Hale settled deeper into cover, listening to the growing panic in their hurried exchanges. They were blind. The Council's automated targeting systems could be tricked, their drones outmaneuvered, but a trained human sniper? That was something they didn't have an answer for. His earpiece crackled again. Council forces engaging hostiles. What's your status? Hale smirked slightly, adjusting his rifle. Thinning the herd. He could hear distant weapons fire now, the telltale hum of Council troops pushing forward. The Droketh would shift their attention soon, but not fast enough. Hale wasn't done yet. He realigned his scope, exhaled, and pulled the trigger. The Droketh learned that day what the Galactic Council had yet to understand. A human didn't need perfect technology. They didn't need an algorithm to tell them where to shoot. They just needed one bullet. The battlefield had changed. Where the Council's forces had once struggled to advance, now they moved with a newfound momentum. The Droketh, previously emboldened by their ability to evade sophisticated targeting systems, were suddenly hesitant. Their attacks faltered. Their ambushes unraveled before they could fully take shape. They had spent years perfecting their tactics against an enemy that relied on cold, calculated precision. But now they faced something else entirely. They faced a predator. From his perch atop a ruined tower, Aaron Hale adjusted his scope. The battlefield stretched before him in jagged wreckage and shifting shadows, but where others might have seen only chaos, he saw patterns. The Droketh were adapting, pulling back, repositioning, trying to identify their unseen hunter. It wouldn't help them. He had already moved. Through the lens, he caught sight of movement. 3 Droketh slipping between the remains of a collapsed structure, their forms nearly indistinguishable from the debris around them. Nearly. Hale exhaled, adjusted, fired. The lead warrior's body jerked as the round found its mark, collapsing with an unceremonious thud. The others hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough. Hale shifted, squeezed the trigger, and another one fell. The last survivor dove for cover, but Hale didn't fire again. He didn't need to. Let them run. Let them spread the fear. The earpiece crackled. Council forces reporting minimal resistance. The Drelkith are breaking ranks. What's your position? Hale scanned the ruins, tracking the enemy's retreat before responding. Still here. A pause. Then the voice returned, this time with something resembling hesitation. Acknowledged. Your actions have been noted. He smirked. They didn't want to admit it, but they were starting to understand. This wasn't just another engagement. This was a shift. The Council had dismissed humans as imprecise, crude in their methods. But warfare wasn't a matter of perfect calculations. It was about control, about shaping the battle in ways the enemy couldn't predict. And nothing was more unpredictable than a human sniper. The wind shifted. He caught a flicker of movement far below. Another group, but these weren't Drelkith. Council forces sweeping the battlefield, securing the ruins now that the resistance had fractured. Hale watched them for a moment, noting the rigid formations, the synchronized movements. Efficient, organized, predictable. One of them, a Zelthian officer, lifted his gaze toward the tower where Hale was positioned. A silent acknowledgement. Hale inclined his head slightly before vanishing back into the ruins. The fight wasn't over yet. There were still more shots to take. The war was not over, but the battle was won. Smoke curled lazily from the ruins, the air thick with the acrid scent of scorched metal and spent ammunition. The once chaotic battlefield had fallen into an eerie stillness, broken only by the methodical movements of the Council's forces as they swept through the remnants of the Drelkith positions. What had been a war of attrition had, in the span of hours, turned into a decisive rout. The Drelkith had fled. Some had tried to regroup, others to burrow into the ruins as they had so many times before. But this time, there was no refuge, no unseen path to strike from the shadows. Every movement had been anticipated, every hiding place marked, every leader silenced before they could issue their next command. In the aftermath, the Council's officers convened in a temporary war room, a repurposed command outpost amidst the wreckage. The tension that had once filled their meetings was absent, replaced with something colder. Reflection, calculation. The hum of holographic displays cast pale light over the assembled figures, detailing enemy movements, casualty reports, projections of what should have been an impossible victory. At the center of it all, Counselor Vyarkesh stood in silence, studying the data. His taloned fingers flexed against the smooth surface of the table, his mandibles shifting in what could almost be considered unease. The human, one of the officers finally spoke, breaking the quiet. His impact on the engagement is undeniable. The admission was hesitant, as though the words themselves were difficult to form. The Council had built its empire on the foundation of superior tactics, precision warfare, and technological supremacy. The idea that victory had hinged on a single soldier, one without neural synchronization, without drone-assisted targeting, without the vast computational power that dictated every other battle, was not something they could easily reconcile. And yet, there it was. Their methods are primitive, another officer added, though even as he said it, the words carried less weight than they once might have. Unstructured, relying on instinct rather than calculation. Vyarkesh exhaled slowly, his multifaceted eyes narrowing. And yet it was precisely that instinct which allowed him to accomplish what our forces could not. A ripple of silence followed. None could refute it. They had all seen the reports. How the Drelkith had been dismantled not by overwhelming firepower, not by superior numbers, but by something far more insidious. Uncertainty. The enemy had not been outgunned. They had been outmaneuvered, hunted, and now The council had to decide what that meant. The chamber doors slid open with a soft hiss, drawing every gaze toward the lone figure who entered. Aaron Hale moved without ceremony, his steps measured, his expression unreadable. His armor bore the scuffs of battle, the faint scent of gunpowder lingering in the air around him, an unfamiliar contrast in a room where war was usually fought from a distance, through data streams and strategic projections. He stopped before the table, meeting Kesh's gaze without hesitation. He had been summoned, but he did not stand at attention like the council soldiers. He was not one of them, and yet they could no longer look at him as an outsider. Kesh studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. "You have given us much to consider." Hale gave a slow nod but said nothing. He had no need to. The results spoke for themselves. The Zelthian's gaze flickered to the data projections once more. "There is potential in your kind," he admitted. The words were careful, deliberate, not an admission of inferiority, but of something unexpected, a variable they had overlooked, a weapon they had never truly considered. Monroe, who had remained silent until now, finally stepped forward, a faint smile playing at the edges of his lips. "I told you," he said lightly, "humans thrive in chaos." Kesh did not smile, but he inclined his head ever so slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. "Perhaps," he said, "it is time we learned to do the same." Hale met his gaze, then turned and walked away. The council had their answer, and so did the galaxy.